Imagine you're standing in the middle of a massive, just a sprawling manufacturing facility. And up on the ceiling, this highly sophisticated sensor system suddenly flashes red. It has perfectly diagnosed a problem, and it sends an alert straight to your phone that says, there is a fire in Sector 4.
Which is obviously a pretty vital piece of information.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's analyzed the environment, identified the anomaly, and communicated it to you flawlessly. But, and here is the catch, you still have to, grab a heavy bucket, physically locate a water source, run all the way across the facility to Sector 4, and put out the fire yourself.
Right. So there is this total separation of awareness and execution. I mean, the system tells you exactly what is wrong, but it completely lacks the agency to actually fix it.
Precisely. And that separation between awareness and execution is the exact friction point we are exploring today. Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're analyzing the impending architectural shift in enterprise financial operations. It's a massive transition from what is known as chain of thought AI to chain of action AI.
Yeah, we are basically looking at a fundamental redesign of how organizations function. And this is entirely driven by a concept called the Internet of Agents.
Right. So the central question we really have to grapple with today is this. Is the transition to autonomous, executing AI agents a necessary evolution that secures a structural competitive advantage? Or, does removing the human execution layer in these really high-stakes financial processes introduce an unjustifiable systemic risk?
It really is the most critical operational question facing enterprises right now. I mean, we are talking about the difference between a tool that gives you advice and a system that actually spends your money.
Exactly. And, well, I represent the view that this shift to a chain of action is an indispensable leap forward. Look, the current era of AI, what we often call the copilot era, has hit a brick wall. And that wall is us, humans.
Which is a pretty big wall, to be fair.
It is. Copilots are brilliant at processing data, drafting summaries, flagging anomalies, but they rely entirely on human throughput to actually get anything done. When you're a global enterprise trying to process, millions of financial transactions daily across a dozen different jurisdictions, that human execution requirement just becomes an insurmountable bottleneck.
Okay, but
Just to finish the thought, replacing that manual effort with a chain of action where AI not only processes information, but executes decisions autonomously within defined parameters, that is the only way to actually get thousands of transactions processed flawlessly without just throwing an army of human analysts at the problem.
Right, well, I come at it from a completely different way. That gap between knowing something and doing something, the action gap as it's called, is not a bug in organizational management. It's actually a feature.
A feature?
Yes. In financial operations, it is a strictly necessary safety buffer. I argue that advisory AI, this chain of thought model, is the absolute appropriate ceiling for enterprise risk, because the moment you cross that line, the moment an AI transitions from, say, recommending a journal entry to autonomously executing an intercompany cash transfer without a human laying eyes on it, the organization becomes terrifyingly dependent on the absolute perfection of its data architecture.
Well, perfection is a strong word.
But it's true. AI agents lack human interpretive capacity. In complex, messy environments, they don't just fail, they fail at machine speed. And that creates massive compliance nightmares, not efficiency.
Okay, let's define exactly where the baseline is right now, just so we are totally clear on the mechanics. The enterprise AI story over the past few years has been entirely dominated by this copilot model, right? These are systems that think. They take in inputs, apply logic, and produce an output that is specifically designed for a human being to read.
Right.
So if a new tax regulation drops, the copilot can read a 100-page document, summarize the compliance changes, flag a potential anomaly in your recent filings, and then draft an email for the controller to review.
And we shouldn't minimize that. I mean, those tools are genuinely useful. The sheer analytical burden on human financial professionals has been reduced significantly. Copilots surface signals and patterns that a human team would otherwise completely miss in the noise.
They do. They're amazing. But the crucial mechanism is that the action still fundamentally requires a human hand. The AI identifies a tax error. A person has to log in and correct it.
Yeah.
The AI spots a reconciliation discrepancy in the general ledger. A person has to investigate and resolve it. Or the AI recommends an optimal payment timing to maximize yield. A person still has to hit, approve, and execute the transfer. The chain of thought ends exactly where the chain of action must begin. And at an enterprise scale, let's be honest, this isn't a true automated solution. It's just a much better informed manual process.
Oh, wait, I need to push back on that phrasing. Manual process shouldn't be used as a pejorative term when we are talking about enterprise finance. Let's look at what the chain of action actually entails. It is a completely different architectural philosophy. You are talking about moving from a sophisticated advisor to an autonomous operator. You are taking an AI and handing it the keys.
Yes, exactly.
You are giving it the ability to process information, make a financial decision, and execute an irreversible action in an enterprise system without waiting for any human approval whatsoever.
Which is exactly what is needed for the specific class of decisions that consume like 90% of human capacity in these departments. We are talking about transaction validation, routine complaint submission, anomaly resolution, payment processing. These are highly rule-based, high-volume, and exceptionally well-defined tasks. Humans shouldn't be wasting their cognitive capacity on them.
Well-defined in theory, maybe, but I'm sorry, I just don't buy that they're perfectly defined in practice. Let me tell you why. The moment you remove the human from the execution layer, you remove a massive layer of unspoken context. When a human accountant looks at an ambiguous tax flag, they don't just blindly apply a rigid rule.
Sure, they use judgment.
Exactly. They apply their understanding of the relationship with that specific vendor. They apply historical context about how this division usually operates. They apply basic ethical reasoning. You are proposing we take all of that nuanced human judgment and hand it over to a rigidly automated system.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how this ecosystem actually operates. Because I think you're picturing one massive monolithic AI that is just guessing at context across the whole company. But the actual technical architecture here is the Internet of Agents. It is a distributed network of highly specialized AI agents, and each one operates autonomously but strictly within a very narrow, clearly defined domain.
Right, and they communicate with each other through standardized protocols.
Exactly. Think about how a transaction validation agent works. Right now, finance teams wait until month end to run these massive batch reconciliations. It's a stressful, reactive event. But in this new architecture, the moment a transaction is generated in the ERP system, a specialized agent jumps on it.
Mm-hmm.
In milliseconds, it validates the data completeness, applies the specific local tax logic, checks the corporate compliance rules, and routes it for regulatory submission. If there is a correctable error, it fixes it instantly. Simultaneously, you have entirely separate reconciliation agents running continuously against the general ledger, matching intercompany positions 24/7. There are no batch cycles. There is no waiting for someone to hit run.
Okay, that sounds incredibly efficient right up until you look at the messy reality of how these agents function in the wild. Let's take cash flow optimization agents.
Sure.
The core concept is that these agents analyze real-time cash positions across global accounts and execute routine cash management decisions autonomously, moving money around, triggering intercompany transfers, initiating VAT reclaims. But what happens when a totally different agent, say an anomaly detection agent, flags a vendor payment pattern that slightly deviates from established norms, but the cash flow optimization agent has already executed the transfer because it saw an opportunity for a slight yield increase?
Well, the parameters for exactly that kind of conflict are defined in advance. If a situation exceeds a predefined risk threshold, like a conflicting signal between two agents, it is immediately escalated to a human reviewer before any irreversible action is taken.
But the line between a routine execution and an irreversible mistake is razor thin at machine speed. Let's go back to your analogy of the fire earlier. You said the chain of thought tells you the building is on fire, and the chain of action actually puts the fire out.
Right.
In financial operations, autonomously putting out the fire might mean executing massive financial actions based on a false positive. If your automated sensor thinks there is a fire and autonomously dumps 10,000 gallons of water into your primary server room, you've just destroyed your own servers for absolutely no reason. That is the risk of an agent without context.
Wow, okay, that's a great visual, though I would frame the reality of the situation quite differently. The systemic damage caused by the human bottleneck currently outpaces the hypothetical risk of a well-constrained agent.
You really think so?
I do. Right now, organizations are drowning. They are trying to process millions of transactions with humans acting as the sole throughput constraint. The distance between knowing there is a discrepancy in a ledger and actually fixing it is where the financial value lives. And human beings simply cannot operate at the speed of modern commerce.
Which brings us perfectly to the core of why this whole transition is so precarious. Let's look at the engine room. Let's talk about the technical reality of what actually allows these agents to function safely. Because agents operating on financial data make decisions at machine speed. But as we agreed, they do it without human interpretive capacity. So how do they not break everything?
Right, which is why the underlying data architecture is so vital. This is the crucial point. Agents are not deployable in isolation. You can't just plug an agent into a legacy system and hope for the best.
Definitely not.
The foundational investment for this entire transition is data quality. Specifically, we are talking about 3 pillars. A canonical data model that standardizes all financial data into a single language, a data orchestration layer that validates and routes that data, and a clean core ERP that generates standard machine-readable data by default.
Okay, let's unpack that, because that is exactly where the entire concept becomes incredibly fragile. Think about what a canonical data model actually requires. It requires flawless uniformity. The reality of this architecture is that an agent presented with an inconsistently structured transaction, a missing required field, or any semantically ambiguous data element will fail.
Well, either by producing an incorrect output or, more likely, by escalating it to a human, yes.
Exactly. And let's be totally honest about enterprise data for a second. If you're a controller listening to this right now, you're probably rolling your eyes at the phrase perfectly clean data. Have you ever seen a global organization with perfectly clean data?
Of course not. No organization has flawless data on day one, which is exactly why the transition to a chain of action requires deliberate, massive architectural investment. Think of the canonical data model like a universal translator at the UN.
Okay.
It doesn't matter if the legacy system from a subsidiary in Japan speaks one data language and the newly acquired startup in Germany speaks another. The model forces them into a single standardized dialect before the AI agent is ever allowed to read it.
But you are assuming that this universal translator and this clean core ERP are actually an achievable reality across dozens of jurisdictions with deeply entrenched legacy systems, varying local compliance laws, and continuous mergers and acquisitions. Relying on an architecture that assumes perfect inputs is a recipe for disaster.
I think disaster is a bit hyperbolic.
Let me give you a very concrete example. Imagine an agent is responsible for executing a $5 million intercompany transfer. The data comes in from a European subsidiary, and the date format is day, month, year. So, 04/05/2026.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Right, but the agent, based in the US, reads it as month, day, year. To a human accountant, the context clues make it obvious whether the transfer is meant for April 5th or May 4th. But to an agent hitting a semantic ambiguity without perfect translation, it might initiate a multi-million-dollar liquidity sweep an entire month early. It doesn't just stop and ponder, it executes. You are escalating what should be a routine manual correction into a catastrophic machine speed cash flow crisis.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the organization is just blindly deploying agents without building the corresponding governance infrastructure first. The canonical data model isn't just a nice-to-have IT project. It is the absolute operational prerequisite. Organizations that are successfully building for the chain of action are redesigning their data flows long before they turn on the agents.
But even then,
And if an agent encounters that ambiguous date format, the governance systems log the exception, they immediately halt that specific autonomous action, and they route it to a human exception specialist with the full context of the failure.
but if the data is as universally messy as it actually is in the real world, your human exception specialist is going to be buried under 10,000 machine speed escalations by lunchtime. You haven't actually solved the bottleneck, you've just moved the bottleneck from the execution layer to the exception layer.
I completely understand that fear, but in practice, the volume of exceptions drops exponentially once that canonical data model is strictly enforced. The agents actually force data discipline across the enterprise. They reject bad inputs so consistently that the upstream systems are forced to clean up their act.
I mean, in a perfect world, sure.
And this leads us directly to how the role of a human being fundamentally transforms in a chain of action world. We aren't eliminating humans. We are concentrating their role on what human brains actually do best.
Which is complex decision-making.
Exactly. Judgment, nuance, relationship management, and ethical reasoning. In a copilot era finance function, you have highly trained, brilliant professionals spending their days executing mundane, rule-based processes. They are manually matching records across 3 different screens.
Yeah, it's tedious.
In an Internet of Agents environment, those humans are elevated. We see the emergence of entirely new roles. You have agent architects who actually design the logic and parameters. You have performance managers who monitor the ecosystem's behavior. And you have exception specialists who handle the highly complex edge case scenarios that the agents escalate. Think of them like city planners designing a flawless traffic grid, rather than just being the traffic cops waving cars to an intersection.
That's a great metaphor, and it is a compelling vision. But I'm genuinely confused how that works in reality. Have you considered the severe cognitive disconnect this creates?
Cognitive disconnect. How so?
Well, the reality of this architecture is that every single automated action must be perfectly explainable and defensible to regulators. You need this robust governance infrastructure to define parameters, monitor performance, and audit actions. But how does a human being effectively govern an AI agent if they are entirely removed from the tactile execution context?
Wait, what do you mean by removed from the context?
When an exception occurs, the agent provides the human specialist with the complete context, the data lineage, and the exact rule it couldn't resolve.
I mean the tactile, intuitive understanding of the work. Let's go back to the city planner metaphor. A city planner who has never actually driven a car on the roads they design doesn't intuitively understand how a single bad pothole causes a cascading traffic jam.
Okay, I see. If you have an exception specialist who has never manually reconciled a complex general ledger because a reconciliation agent has always done it for their entire career, how do they possess the deep, intuitive execution familiarity required to know when the agent's logic is subtly starting to degrade? You are creating a generation of governance professionals who are essentially managing black boxes.
But they aren't black boxes. That's the difference between legacy neural networks and this specific architecture. The standardized protocols and the data orchestration layer ensure that every single step is highly auditable. The agent architect defines the logic precisely, and they can see exactly which decision tree the agent followed.
Defining logic in a pristine sandbox is very different from executing it in the messy reality of global finance. Governance capability without deep, hands-on execution familiarity leads directly to uncontrolled agents.
I disagree.
Well, let's say the regulatory environment changes. Say a local tax jurisdiction alters its digital submission formatting overnight. Your compliance monitoring agent might flag the regulatory change, but your transaction validation agents are still executing submissions at machine speed using yesterday's logic. The human oversight layer is now so detached from the day-to-day mechanical flow of data that by the time the performance manager identifies the degradation, the compliance breach has already occurred on tens of thousands of automated transactions.
But that exact scenario is why the compliance monitoring agents and transaction validation agents operate as a linked ecosystem. The monitoring agent doesn't just flag a change for a human to read, it assesses the impact of regulatory changes and automatically flags required logic adjustments for the agent architect with sufficient lead time. It's a continuous, systemic feedback loop.
If the loop functions perfectly, sure.
And regarding your point about the human element losing touch, the reality is that governing these agents is significantly harder work than manual data entry. It requires genuine, deep expertise and systems thinking. We aren't dumbing down the finance workforce. We are demanding much higher order analytical capabilities from them.
Oh, I agree completely that it demands higher order capabilities. My core contention is that human organizational design simply cannot transform as rapidly as the technology demands. You are taking controllers, analysts, and treasury professionals whose entire career and organizational structure were designed for the manual era, and you are expecting them to seamlessly transition into performance managers and agent architects.
But organizations that try to deploy autonomous agents into an old legacy structure are going to create massive confusion. The technology choice is the chain of action, yes, but the organizational design has to follow intentionally. Those leaders who are building the governance infrastructure and defining these new human roles today are the ones securing a massive advantage over their competitors.
Intentionally is the operative word there. But let's be real, relentless market pressure rarely allows for intentional, slow, careful restructuring. The competitive pressure you mentioned earlier is going to push enterprises to deploy operational AI long before their data is clean and long before their human workforce is ready to govern it.
That's a fair concern.
The action gap might be frustrating, but the friction of human execution provides one indispensable thing: accountability. If a copilot AI suggests an incorrect journal entry and a human accountant approves it, there is clear accountability. If an autonomous agent executes 1 million incorrect journal entries over a holiday weekend because of one semantically ambiguous data element, who is accountable? The agent architect who designed it? The canonical data model?
The accountability lies squarely within the governance infrastructure itself, which is managed by the performance leaders. Because the system is designed to log everything, the audit evidence agents continuously generate and organize the exact documentation supporting every single autonomous action. Audit-ready evidence is available on demand. The transparency is actually exponentially higher in a mature agent ecosystem than it is in a massive team of human analysts, where errors can easily be hidden, forgotten, or manually glossed over.
Transparency of the error logs, yes. But transparency does not equal control. Flawlessly logging 1 million errors doesn't magically unexecute 1 million flawed intercompany transfers.
I completely see why you emphasize the risk. It is daunting, but keeping humans as the primary executing layer simply because they provide friction is an unsustainable long-term strategy. The distance between what a modern enterprise knows and what it can actually do is growing wider every single day. If you choose to remain in the chain of thought model, generating better and better insights, but relying on human hands to slowly act on them, your organization will simply be outpaced. The sheer volume of data and the blistering speed of modern commerce demand machine speed execution.
And I maintain that machine speed execution without human interpretive capacity remains a profound structural hazard. The absolutely rigid requirements for perfectly standardized data and flawless human governance make this chain of action model incredibly brittle. Complex regulatory environments are inherently messy, and assuming we can build a clean core that perfectly translates that mess into safe, autonomous action is an engineering fantasy.
So we arrive at a fascinating impasse, but also, I think, a point of profound convergence. Because regardless of the risks, we both clearly agree that AI is fundamentally shifting from purely advisory capabilities to executional ones. The era of the copilot acting as the ultimate ceiling of enterprise AI is officially over.
Absolutely. There is no debate there. The shift towards some form of operational AI is inevitable, and it clearly demands a total, ground-up redesign of the finance function's organizational structure. The roles we hire for today will simply not be the roles we have tomorrow.
Right. The enduring disagreement between us lies purely in how we view the consequences of that shift. I see the transition to a chain of action as finally closing a dangerous action gap. It solves the throughput constraint that has been choking enterprises, and it finally allows humans to focus on true ethical and strategic judgment. Organizations that build this data architecture now are securing an insurmountable structural advantage.
Well, I look at that exact same shift and see the removal of a vital layer of human judgment. The friction that you call a bottleneck, I call an essential safety mechanism. The prerequisites for the Internet of Agents, the perfect data, the flawless governance, are so absolute that they risk introducing an unprecedented level of fragility into global financial systems if deployed prematurely.
It is a critical, perhaps defining tension for any enterprise leader to navigate right now. Understanding both the immense operational potential of the Internet of Agents and the rigorous, unforgiving technical prerequisites it demands is no longer optional. There is so much more to explore here, particularly regarding how these newly designed roles, like the agent architects and exception specialists, will actually function in the trenches of day-to-day finance once the novelty wears off.
The organizational psychology of that transition alone is worth deep consideration. Moving an entire workforce from executors to governors is going to be incredibly complex.
We leave it to you, the listener, to determine if your own organization is truly ready for the shift. Think back to that sensor on the factory ceiling flashing red, identifying the fire with perfect analytical precision. The question you have to answer on Monday morning is this: are you still pouring all your resources into optimizing the system that just tells you the fire exists, or are you ready to build the architecture that actually puts it out? The copilot era was just a rehearsal. The agent era is the performance. We'll see you next time on The Debate.